Welcome to Exceptionally Speaking, the podcast where we explore how to better understand and support exceptional learners. I'm Dr. Meryl, and each week I sit down with dedicated educators, parents, and advocates to share real strategies, inspiring stories, and moments of hope. If you're enjoying these conversations or learning something new, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Ryan McClintock, a gifted educator and thought leader whose journey into education is anything but traditional. With a background in biochemistry and law enforcement, Ryan discovered his passion for teaching through peer tutoring, and that spark has led to more than a decade of work in public education. He now serves in Douglas County Schools as a future educator pathway instructor and facilitator of gifted education, where he's helping shape the next generation of teachers. In this conversation, we explore the evolving landscape of secondary education, especially for gifted learners in high school. Ryan shares how his diverse experiences across states, school systems, and teaching environments have shaped his approach to teaching. We talk about the importance of relevance, relationships, and rigor in education, and how student agency and teacher curiosity can completely transform a classroom. We also dive into topics like weighted course selection and differentiation, how advanced learning plans can amplify gifted student voices, and the role of technology and AI in supporting both students and educators. Throughout it all, he brings clarity, nuance, and a deep belief in the potential of young people and the educators who serve them. You can find more information about Ryan and all our guests at hex24press.com. Please enjoy Exceptionally Speaking with Dr. Ryan McClintock. Hey, Ryan, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me here on Exceptionally Speaking today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited for the conversation. Excited to hang out with you. Catch up with you a little bit.
It's been a while. So I know your expertise really lies in secondary education and really more specifically in that gifted and advanced student lens. And I'd really just like to start with how did you even get into education and how did you land where you are today? And any portions of the story along the way, I'd be interested to hear.
So what I heard was, how did I get into education first? And then, kind of yada, 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 gifted education. I think, pack a lunch a little bit. Because if you would have told me I'd be an educator when I was in high school, I would have laughed. School was fine. School, I didn't mind it. I was a gifted student myself. But I was kind of into sports, into soccer, and just kind of getting through high school. And I never thought I'd be a teacher, but I was always kind of sitting back and critiquing everything that was going on, respectfully, of course, that my teachers were doing. And so I went off to university, and I actually was studying biochemistry and was pre-med for the longest time. When I started doing my actual own research in a lab, I was fortunate to go to a school that basically the master's level students were top dogs at my university. It didn't grant PhDs. And the reason that's important is because in research labs, they often were doing the work that like postdocs or doctoral students would be doing in biochemistry and science. And then us undergrads could come in and just do more than just kind of like, wash the glassware and whatnot. And so once I started doing actual research, is when I realized this is amazing. This is awesome. Up until then, I would just tolerate a lot of the lab courses that were there, which were basically activity-ized versions of kind of the class and the lectures and whatnot. I could go in the lab at 2 a.m. if I wanted to and get some work done. I was part of a real team. We're compiling our research and writing things up and presenting and whatnot. And so then when I realized I could actually go to grad school for that and rather than medical school, and instead of paying a lot of money to go to medical school, that actually go to graduate school in hard science would be paid for by universities and even stipended. And I said, let me take a look at that, because certainly grown-up money was definitely something I had to kind of worry about. And so I was lucky enough to actually leave for undergrad and skip master's level and actually go into a PhD program out in Michigan. And that was my plan. My plan was to become a professor in biochemistry. And that's when I started to kind of get the teacher bug, actually at that point, because I was a tutor as an undergrad and everything. And I really just enjoyed colleagues or helping other students understand concepts. And while I was in grad school, one of first of a few turns, I don't know how long we have here, Meryl, but one of a first of a few turns.
A long time.
Was a really, really bad accident that I was involved in.
Okay.
Traffic accident. It was just prior to leaving out to Michigan. I was still in Southern California, which I don't think I mentioned at all. And I was actually driving to back to school to the lab and got hit head on the highway. And spun me around and flipped me several times. And all I know is when I came to, somehow I was okay. I was pretty banged up and had some kind of relatively minor injuries to my back and to my legs and to my head a little bit, and was able to kind of get out of that. And that kind of rattled me a little bit and said, what am I really doing? And do I actually want to continue through kind of this doctoral portion at this time? And I was like, okay. And I did. And I went out into Michigan and got started, but I had to come back at one point because the collision was so messy on a Southern Cal freeway. And there was just a lot going on legally. And I had come back several times to kind of work through that. And so I'd actually take a leave from the university to kind of work through a lot of that. And while I was on leave, didn't have a vehicle because my vehicle was still gone. I was able to kind of this is in Yorba Linda, California, walk to a local shopping center that was nearby where I was living and work at a couple of the places that were this one shopping center. And one of them was a coffee shop. And I said, oh, I can work here. And he wanted me to manage the shop. And it was like a deli and everything. And I did that was there a couple months. Loved it. Just loved talking to everybody, talking to the regulars, getting to know everybody. And while I was doing that, I was still, at that point, I was wondering, should I go back? Should I continue on and keep going biochemistry like that? Because the accident did kind of just shake me up a little bit. There were so many reasons why I should not have walked away from that.
Yeah.
And the owner of the coffee shop was a retired sergeant in the LA County Sheriff's Department. And at one point, working for him, and he was a great guy, just a really nice mentor. And he said, have you ever considered law enforcement? And I said, like forensics? And he said, no, like actually. And I said, absolutely no, I have not. And he said, well, would you go on a ride along? And I said, well, is a ride along what it sounds like? I'll just kind of spend a shift. And he said, it's what it sounds like. And so he arranged for me to go on a ride along. And I was living in Orange County, which is just south of LA County. And it was in LA County, and it was at the East LA station there. And I'll never forget getting there. And the moment we pulled out of the station, the deputy I was riding with, Deputy Ramos, I remember he was driving so fast out of the station. I remember having this thought of, we're going to get pulled over. And then it just dawned on me. And it was just throughout the entire shift and his approach and really kind of how he interacted with everybody. And not going to lie, some of the adrenaline of the evening that I said, okay, I'll go on a couple more of these at different stations. And I did. And I think part of it was I was just really ready to just kind of explore some other things. I felt like I could get back into Michigan where I was at on the leave absence, but I still felt like I kind of wanted to just explore a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And part of it I realized about myself is I like the challenge, and the challenge of getting hired and getting trained is significant. It takes some time to kind of get in and get hired, and I did. And then it takes a lot of focus and challenge to kind of get through the academy, and I did, and learned a lot about myself along the way. And then I started working in LA County, and for Sheriff's Department, you start working in custody. You work in the jails before you transition onto patrol. And LA is huge. And so the number of jails that they have there, I mean, at the time, I think there was like 6 or 7. And so I was downtown LA working at what was called Twin Towers Correctional Facility, which was a brand new jail, modern facility. Looks a lot like our new middle schools that we have built in our district.
Sad but true, yeah.
Kind of our high schools a little bit. And so anyway, I started working that, and my goal was actually to stay in it, promote eventually, and LA County had a really kind of cutting edge lab and forensics unit that, as coming in sworn rather than a scientist coming in from the law enforcement side, you could actually oversee it. And that was something I think that down the road, I was hoping to kind of get into. But I did the job. I learned a lot about people, a lot about myself. While I was doing that. And so you'll be in the jails for a little bit before you go on patrol, and you leave the jails based on which stations you choose. The busier the station, the quicker you'll get out of the jails. If you choose like Lenox or East LA, you're going to get out faster than if you choose, say, Malibu. But along the way, what happened was I got off training and was recognized as doing a good job, and then was asked to become a training officer, like really quickly. And so
to become a teacher.
Yeah, to become a teacher. And that's exactly what happened. And at that point, I started to notice I didn't really care as much about what I was teaching, which I did, of course, but I just really cared that the people I was working with understood it and were growing in confidence and competence. And so that was another little sign. And then also along the way, I got married to my wonderful wife, who was a teacher. Important part of this story that I'll accelerate here. But while I was working, I was actually injured at some point. And so I had to heal up a little bit. And part of that process, it's kind of another pattern, just like the car accident, but another kind of physical issue. And I was still with the Sheriff's Department, but healing. And in California, you can essentially go and get your emergency license if you have a bachelor's to kind of go substitute teach. So I said, why not? If I have to be home for this, I can go do that. And I did. And the first class I walked into, I should say Mrs. McClintock walked out, Mr. McClintock came in, and it was a second grade class. And so the very first time I ever subbed was for second grade. And I just had a blast. And it wasn't just, babysitting and keep an eye on them. I was going through our lessons, and and that's when I knew. I said, okay, this is something I really kind of want to accelerate at some point. I don't think I'm going to stay in law enforcement as a career forever. And then the next, and this, by the way, was the district that my wife worked in, was the district I grew up in. And so it was really neat.
How interesting.
Some former teachers that were colleagues. And then the high school down the street said, hey, would you come in and sub for us? And it was the first time I stepped into a high school that I was like, this really is it. Because the energy, the students, everything going on. And I think having the background in working in law enforcement, but specifically working in custody in the jails, you have to, you carry a flashlight, you carry some pepper spray, and you carry some handcuffs and a radio. And the rest is just, you have to engage with folks. And some of the smartest people I ever met were incarcerated. And they just had different life circumstances, made a few different decisions, and that's how we ended up meeting. And so the first gig they gave me in high school was, they said, hey, can you do 2 weeks? And I said, actually, I can. But that's about all I can do, because then I have to kind of get back to some other stuff. And they said it was for health. And I said, okay, I'll do that. What's the topic? And the topic was sex ed. And so that was and they said, if you can kind of get through that, if you can teach 2 weeks of freshman sex ed as a baby-faced 20-something-year-old, then you should probably look at this. And I ended up doing that and transitioned out of the sheriff's department, which is not easy to do. They kind of put you through several ringers to make sure you've thought this through. But the moment you say education and teaching, they're like, okay, you're trading one noble profession for another type thing. And then eventually I also taught freshman language arts and leadership and reading. And they said, hey, there's a chemistry opening. And so I was able to kind of slide right into that. And at that point, I was still non-traditional. I didn't go to school immediately to teacher school, if you will. I was able to kind of go to teacher school while I was actively teaching, which was probably one of the best decisions I ever made, because in that program, I was able to choose my own mentors at the school rather than just kind of being matched in like a student teacher program.
Yeah.
Partner up with three amazing teachers who taught students from all over the kind of learning spectrum, if you will. At the time, they had AP, and later the school became an IB school. And then I had another science teacher that I was working with who was teaching a lot of students that were new to country and learning not in their native language. And he was just amazing at that. And so I really, really appreciate that I got both sides of that. And then there's a calculus teacher who is still teaching today. She's, I think, year 43 or 44. And she really helped me kind of learn how to relate to students, not just naturally, but how to actually make that a priority to kind of get to know students. And so while I was starting to teach there with my fellow chemistry instructor, who was really concerned about us being on the same page, which is important because he didn't want one of us to be, too hard, too easy or anything like that, that he kind of exposed me to gifted, or GATE in California, gifted education as a teacher, because he had the opportunity to launch a new course at the school, which was eventually became an honors course. And that's important because it's a little bit different, but at the time it was being developed for GATE students. And so he got to go through some training, and I got to go through that training with him. He actually took me along, and it was actually through special education, but that was my first exposure to kind of formal approaches and considerations and characteristics and needs. For me personally, it was kind of validating, and it was answering a lot of questions I had as a student growing up. One question I didn't even know at one point why I was moved from one elementary school to another when I was younger, and it was for some programs that the other elementary school had. At the time, I just didn't even really know that. And so we developed that course, and I worked there alongside him and was able to teach various levels of chemistry and doing rather well there with him. And then eventually my wife and my young family we decided to move, and we ended up moving. I feel like I should pause there because that's like phase one.
It is phase one. But there was no physical trauma that happened that sent you to Colorado at that point?
Nope, no physical trauma at that point, other than we were living in Orange County, California, and two teachers. And my oldest son was, at the time, he was about one and a half, when we started thinking, where might we look that might just be a little bit more affordable? Even though I really enjoyed being raised and growing up in Southern California, it was just wonderful in terms of just the density and the diversity and just being able to, there's just so much going on all the time. And so we started moving in, looking inland, like a lot of people do. And next thing you know, you're in the desert and whatnot. And we started looking around the Phoenix area, and we went there in July, which was a mistake because everything.
No, that's actually maybe a good choice because you need to know what it's like.
we had to know what it was like, and everything kind of looked like sepia color, and I'm like, this is really interesting. And I'm like, you smell that? And I'm like, that's our flesh. And so like that was just, we looked around Vegas area because at the time Vegas, Clark County was really kind of blown up. And then I said, if I can't be kind of near, this will sound just really maybe a little spoiled, but like if I can't be near the water, because I grew up just a 20-30 minute drive to the beach, then maybe some mountains or something. And so we just decided to kind of check out Colorado because my mentor teacher, the gentleman I was talking about earlier, one of them, the chemistry instructor who I developed the GATE course with, he at some point looked at moving to Colorado with his family. And he told me about some district out there out in Colorado. And so we went out and took a look at it. And Colin, again, was like, he was really young and he stayed home. And my wife and I looked at Fort Collins. And then we drove down to Springs, and we didn't even, this thing called Castle Rock in Douglas County was just, we just drove right through it. Didn't have a clue it was there. And started looking around, and I'm like, this is really nice out here. And then I got a call from a colleague who had actually left my high school and moved out with her husband and family to Colorado. And she said, you didn't stop by. You didn't tell us you were out there. I said, where are you? And she said, Castle Rock. And I said, oh, that's like Douglas County area. And I said, I think I remember that funny shaped rock structure that we drove past on the 25. She said, yeah, there's a brand new high school opening up that's doing things a little differently, and I think you'll like it. It's got schools within schools. It's got an accelerated schedule that will let students kind of double up in certain subjects and also just be real creative with their programming. And what do you think? And so then I reached out to the principal and talked to him, and he flew out for an interview. And the reason why I'm pausing on the interview is because it was a 4-hour interview.
Whoa.
When we went out there, and it was an assessment center. I got there and you're just having lunch and hanging out with a bunch of folks in the library, and you don't know at the time, but someone's been assigned to you to kind of, get to know you and observe you. And then you go, and the first was the fishbowl. The very first part of the assessment center was you're sitting in a room around other candidates. And some of these candidates could be for the same position you're applying to or other fields. And there's just a prompt with questions, and you just have to discuss it. And they're sitting out there just kind of watching and listening. And I'll never forget, one of the first questions was, who owns an F? In reference to student, teacher, both. And that's when I realized I really enjoy these conversations. And then you have to go to other scenarios where literally you walk in and you pick up a paper and it says, student is upset about grade and is going to come talk to you. Let monitor in the room know when you're ready. And so I looked up, and there was just one teacher sitting in the corner, and I'm like, I'm ready. And then a student would come in, and it's just game on, and you start talking. And for me, that's where that law enforcement training was helpful, because all law enforcement training is like scenario based. And so you just go with it. And then there was another one with a parent, another one with a colleague. It just went on and on. And I felt as I kept going, I wanted to keep going. I didn't want it to end. And that was a good sign. So that's important, because when I started at that high school, everyone that came in had gone through that and enjoyed it. And it was such a humbling experience to just work with educators who were coming from places where they were just wonderful educators who decided to kind of stop and shift gears and come to this high school. And I learned a ton while I was there, and had to learn to adapt. Essentially, all of our courses got compacted without even using that phrase at the time. And so I went over there and was teaching science at that point for a few years before I shifted gears again. And at that point, we had our second son out here, and we're kind of settling in. And so I enjoyed the new high school. We were living in Douglas County in Colorado, which was a bit of a shift for me a little bit, just in terms of everything around me, the density, the diversity, and things that I really appreciated about Southern California upbringing, and just getting to know a new community with maybe some different expectations.
Thinking about your transition from where you were teaching in California and then coming over to Douglas County, I know you mentioned compacting, although maybe it wasn't called that at the time, but that's what was happening. What else did you see immediately that was like, oh, this is different and this is serving this student population better?
Yeah, there are a couple things that I'll first mention that I didn't like at first, or that were rather surprising, and then some things that started to kind of grow on me. Change is always hard, especially change location, another child, new job, everything like that. But without realizing it, I had left a school that had been around for 90 something years, and that had over 60 spoken languages in it. And my time there, it also became a magnet school and a tech school. And so it really had all kinds of programming. And I had students from all kinds of different ethnicities, a lot of Southeast Asia, India, Middle East, Mexico, and Central California. And just interacting with some families where a lot of times, I could go to their house, knock on the door, and have conversations with the family, or be invited over for dinner. and whatnot. And when I first started at the school I was at, the instructional staff was rocking and rolling, but the culture hadn't been yet established. And so little things like I would notice that right after school, it just cleared out. It just completely cleared out. And so if you needed a student to come back to kind of work through a problem or something like that, in chemistry and physics or whatever, good luck. It just wasn't happening. It just felt much more transactional to me. And that was something to kind of get used to. But it was also an opportunity that we talked about at the school, because the school basically was launched to really address words that since then have become very, very buzzy, but rigor, relevance, and relationships. And was designed all about that. And the one that we talked about a lot was relationships, but the one I really was concerned with was relevance, because I used to say something just to kind of get attention. And so for these numbers, these aren't real numbers, but like, we spend like 95% of our time is what it seemed like to have students hopefully absorb certain concepts. And then only to find that like maybe 95% of it, all of it was just kind of forgotten. Like the forgetting curve is real, and it really started to kind of give me the question, like, what are we doing here? And when students are spending this much time in our buildings, it's actually a privilege. They're spending most of their time with us. And it brought up the whole idea of kind of like righteous challenge. We talk a lot about students who need a little extra help. And I was working with more and more students of privilege, certainly, who had lots of supports and were very capable. And I was kind of wondering, what are you really getting out of this? You're building a transcript of impressive course titles, but are you being pushed? And many times it seemed like the answer was no. Aside from maybe some programs that we started to kind of launch outside of school, some enrichment type programs and competitions and everything. Now, another detail about the school that's important is the school had 5 schools within schools, which were called academies. Okay. And so when students joined, and they could change these, but they would basically choose from visual and performing arts, what later ended up becoming called STEM, which was originally called Math, Science, and Engineering. We also had a biotechnology and health science academy, humanities academy, and fifth one, kind of a leadership type of an academy. And so when the kids came in, the idea was that when they're taking chemistry for me, I might have a class that if I'm in the visual performing arts academy, that many of my students will be kind of motivated and interested in visual and performing arts. And so how might I differentiate, or how might I kind of plan the curriculum around that and then kind of lay out the instruction? What would that look like to a group of students who are interested in biotechnology or health sciences? And furthermore, we were housed in pods here, and I'm trying not to bring up the jail example, but in different pods, and we were office together. I should say office rather than house.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I would have like a shoulder colleague who maybe is an English teacher, and another teacher to my left who's math or something. That was profound. There's give and take there. Traditionally, you're going to be around a bunch of science teachers, a bunch of math teachers, or whatever your department is. But I would talk to the English teacher and learn tons from her. Techniques, ideas, pedagogy, and then just knowing what they were doing in that class that I could bring into my classes softly would influence the students as well. And I think what I realized is there's like this hidden gear. I call it like this virtuosity. There's like this kind of like this resonance that when you pay attention to the flow and the pacing and the rhythm and the context of the learning, that students are going to feel that more, and it's going to feel less transactional and then maybe a little bit more transformational. And part of that was the change and how when you humble yourself and leave the school where I was set. I was set at the school that I started at. Yeah. I could be there. I was already
teach there forever, and
we just pulled up our roots and went somewhere new. And next, you know what, I'm next to everyone I'm working with was also like a teacher of the year here and there and this, that, and the other. And it was very humbling. We had advisements that met daily, whereas at my other school, we tried advisement once or twice, like once a week, and it always kind of fizzled a little bit. And I related to my students, but now I was seeing them daily for like 50 minutes in between different classes, because the students only had 4 classes a day, which is the beauty of this schedule we were on. And I had to really lean in with them. And I realized I thought I didn't. And then I was trying to listen to them more and get to know them. And I would find out that to me, it was just unacceptable how much our students were just kind of giving up. Not like giving up, but actually just coming to school and saying, let me just get through the day. I'll do this stuff, but then I'll go home and do what I'm really, really, really interested in.
Yeah.
And I don't want to take their stuff at home and bring it to school, but what can we do a little bit differently? And so along the way, I was still teaching, but I had finished up a master's program in basically instructional design and e-learning at the time, because I just felt like there was a need to kind of start bringing in that technology a little bit more, and actually left my school briefly and went to a different district and was working central district as a technology coordinator, which I had to kind of get used to a very different pace from working in a building to kind of working in central district. And I'm sure you completely understand that.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, I was kind of out a little bit of the day to day, and it just opened my mind to just all kinds of ideas. And I was still working with folks at my other school in my district. And we had put together a plan, a proposal that basically was going to back to that school within the school structure and really kind of blow it up a little bit more. Because, when you try something new in education, unless you've got like a lot of consistency, which we don't always, we have turnover in leadership, and then things start to kind of, chip away and kind of come back to just kind of, I would just call it, I'll label that traditional. And so the idea that we could kind of launch this proposal, which was very interdisciplinary, it was bringing all these teachers together in a common area, and students were going to be across different grades. And it was going to be very responsive in terms of their questions or curiosity, but everything was still going to be rooted in their standards, and was going to take teachers who had the ability to kind of respond like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was approved by the district, and it was enough that enticed me to come back and start that program. I can't tell you how much I learned about that. I think the first thing I noticed, and how to we called it the Mosaic Collective, but how much to summarize that in just a few minutes. But the one thing I realized that the kids that were resisting the most to joining those classes were probably our highest achievers, and embedded in there would be our gifted, talented students. Now,
so resisting participating
because it seemed different, and it was going to affect their transcripts a little bit, because maybe if they go take those courses there, what had to come off the plate?
Right. It messes with the transcript game when you have a different program.
Yeah, I call it the AP Calc problem because we all need to get AP Calc on our transcripts.
Yeah.
But the students we were getting from Gifted and Talented, for instance, were students that at first just seemed to have kind of a different swagger to them. Like they're like, grades. I mean, I kind of want to learn this stuff. I'm here and I want to design my own projects and go with that. And I want to work with some people from industry that are going to come in, because that's what we were doing. We were essentially would launch these inquiries, if you will. And it was all very structured and guided through, but it was driven by their passion and their curiosity. And it was those kids that I started paying attention to, those students. They really weren't motivated by the grades at all. Some would be classically kind of observed as underachievers, but not all. Many were doing fine, but they were happy with A's or B's or even C's at times, but they just really wanted to go. They wanted to kind of work with those folks and design a food truck and build the food truck, and then build a business with the food truck and all this kind of stuff is one little example. And so I started kind of thinking again about gifted and talented education at that point. And I started to kind of, as I looked into it some more, really started to convince myself that there were a very vulnerable population in schools, mainly because what I continued to discover, remember, I came into education kind of through a non-traditional way. Right. But when I started looking at like the teacher prep programs that were out there, students weren't getting anything about gifted and talented education that I got with my mentor back in Southern California when we were designing that class. And we were just entirely relying on teachers and their natural ability to work with students, their own backgrounds. But with that comes a lot of biases as well, and maybe a lot of kind of ignorance about gifted students and how much of it immediately focus on academics. And could we also focus on social emotional? What is it to go into a class that at times might feel a little slow? You're making connections a little faster, but you've also learned not to say anything about it, because when you say something, you're going to get more work rather than different work. And so you just watch this conversation they're having with themselves, but you also start to see what happens when they work together. And that gets back to this idea of kind of this virtuosity, this resonance, this buzz that comes out of that. And so I started to really kind of see that more and more as I was working in Mosaic literally working alongside with English teachers and math teachers in every core area to actually build the instruction and the curriculum with the student through these projects. Most simply you would call it like project-based learning or problem-based learning, but it was really more than that. And it was very structured. A lot of work went into that. And that's what also reminded me that I really like kind of wonking out on designing curriculum, because I think, teachers should have some idea of like curriculum development, pedagogy, and instruction. I think the myth is that we have to have all three, but I think every teacher should be really good at least in one of those.
Right.
And if you're not really into kind of curriculum development, maybe you should be working with a teacher who is. But in that environment, we had to kind of learn to be good at all three of those.
Does that program still exist?
It does not.
It does not. Okay.
And because I want to let you know where that program led me personally, but
Yeah.
it doesn't still exist mainly because of turnover. That was
Okay.
the other thing was, remember, this was happening in a school that already had schools within schools, or we called them academies, and I can't label the staff very easily because if I were to say progressive, aggressive, with some traditional, I mean, it was just a really
Sure.
kind of rockin' staff. At the time in my district, though, there was a lot of change with salaries and whatnot at kind of the more central at the board level, and there was just a lot of movement out of schools to neighboring districts that were either paying more. I mean, everybody had their own reasons for kind of departing. Myself, remember, I left and came back, but part of my reason for leaving and going to a neighboring district was because I just finished up a master's degree, and it was in this kind of area of ed tech, but also because I was still on a locked salary for a couple of years, and that was going to unfreeze me. And so there was just a lot of turnover going on, and even in leadership. But again, even in a building where you have these folks that were more open-minded, we could start to see with turnover, the tolerance for the conversation, the tolerance for the transformational approaches started to slip a little bit. We had folks come in from all over the world, experts, consultants working with us. And what also part of the rule would be if we brought someone in to kind of work with us in Mosaic, like Peter Gray, for instance, out of Boston, who's kind of does a ton of research, psychologist, but does a ton of research on play and true play and human evolution and true learning. He'd come out and work with our kids and work with us, but then he would also spend time with the staff, like say 2 evenings in the auditorium with the whole community would come in, and it was almost like a speaker series. But even then, it was just enough that it takes a really nuanced leadership to kind of work with the staff where the staff goes, oh, as the principal, maybe you're giving too much attention to the chosen ones in this program. And so how do you kind of keep that building at scale? That was my first example of how hard that is to do that. And everybody had their reasons for it. Another aspect of the program that wasn't part of the initial design, what we decided to go for was the idea that we actually did not give grades. Students would earn credit, and the amount of feedback we gave them was ridiculous. And families were involved, and it was all narrative-based and evidence, but it wasn't just a letter.
Yeah. Which is obviously very controversial to go down that route, but sounds like you guys designed it in a way that was beneficial for students. So
yeah, and this is maybe about 9-10 years ago that this was still going, and then how to transcript that. And so we had to create all these new courses in the district and everything, but it's not there because it was a lot of work and it was a lot of stress. And also we had to really work as a team, a big team. We essentially had 2 content members from every kind of core area and electives all working together, pretty strong personalities. And that's when I realized that I needed to consider administration because our principal wanted to work with us, but he had a full building to run. And so I decided to lean in and actually go and get a principal's license. And that's important because then that led to a time where I was working in administration and also an instructional coach in the building, but really thinking more and more about our gifted students, because this is right about the time that advanced learning plans in Colorado were really coming on board and no one knew how to handle those. They were just given to administrators as other duties as assigned. And I happened to be that person. I wanted them. And then that's when I basically leaned into the University of Denver. I knew I wanted to go back to school some more. And then I saw that program at University of Denver for the educational doctorate in curriculum instruction, focusing on gifted ed. And I said, let's go for that. I felt like another challenge, and that's when we met essentially in our cohort together.
Yeah. And so you moved into administration at the same time as I'm ready to start this doctorate. That was kind of a similar time period.
Might have been it was 2 years prior. So the first year, though, I don't always count because, but I was working specifically in the Mosaic Collective in that program. And then the year after, which would be right before the cohort at Denver, is when I said, okay, we realized we had to come on the Mosaic plane a little bit. And that was going to release me to work for the building in general. But along the way, also, there were a couple of spin-offs from Mosaic that, remember, this was still a pretty kind of high-flying school with like big ideas and let's try this. And there were some other courses. So it moved the needle, which I'm proud of, but it really moved the needle broadly for all the other courses as well. And those courses are actually still taught. I can maybe talk about those another time, but one's called Futurology, and it's just a neat course. And but yeah, I think about officially 2 years before.
So when you started your doctorate, did you have a goal in mind outside of conduct research? Did you have something that you're like, I want to impact my school in some way? What was your thinking behind that as you made that decision?
So I think there was a convergence of factors going on there. One, I really wanted to advance, broadly speaking, just the voice. And I just felt like there was a lot of potential that was left to chance in our schools. Like as a father, you're just hoping for a really good teacher along the way. Like,
Yeah.
okay, third grade was a great teacher, and fourth grade was okay, and fifth grade was okay, and sixth grade was amazing. And that's really unacceptable. When you think about it, there's just so much that you're just kind of rolling the dice. And I felt the same way about my students in the high school, that if they got the right teacher who recognized and they happened to have the right conversation, and then they were able to on their own kind of work together and have kind of enriching conversations, and that teacher would then look out for that student and go, oh, I just saw this wonderful video the other day on that topic you brought up and I'm sharing it with you. And that's a great relationship. But there's so much chance into that happening. How many students weren't getting that chance, right? How many students had that ability and those gifts, but were maybe kind of quieter, and they just wore several masks at school and couldn't wait to go home. And that to me is unacceptable for all students, but because that was very much my mentality, but especially our gifted and talented students. And so it was, and I know the advanced learning plan is really a nod towards making that less, right? Of kind of like just a chance encounter. But I really wanted to amplify that conversation. I also knew that our teachers were capable of so much more, that they just don't have the training. And then I saw professional development, and excuse my just kind of being flip with this, but professional development kept getting more bloggy to me, where it was like how many sessions would start by saying, okay, we have an hour. It's really a 2-week training, but I'm going to condense it to an hour. And then I know everybody needs something that they can implement in their classrooms tomorrow. And I'd sit there and go, no. I don't need something I can implement in my classrooms tomorrow. Like maybe I need to read something or have conversations, and maybe I need to learn how to implement this, because I'm seeing a lot of ideas being implemented poorly, and that harms the students. And so people will say, oh, project-based learning light, right? For instance, but our students were kind of being exposed to more of these kind of strategies and techniques, and I wasn't sure how deeply evidence-based they were.
Yeah.
And I know we need to hustle in education. And so it was kind of a convergence of, I really know our teachers are capable of a lot more, but they need to be supported. And our students, absolutely. But I also was starting to really kind of question, why do we do what we do, period? Like, why do we have chemistry and algebra 2? And why do we have these just kind of these labeled courses? You know, cells and bells is maybe a phrase you've heard before. And could it be done something a little bit more kind of natural or holistic? And when you start to make these changes where you allow students to kind of ask questions, we subtly moved into an area of clarifying questions. Asking questions became clarifying questions. But what about big questions? And like how schools changed, how hospitals changed, how's transportation, things that you could like sink your mind and your teeth into. Those are big questions. And if you want kids to ask questions, you need to let them ask questions. And asking questions and having discussions about questions, we know that's not new. That's how we learn. But this dynamic was so interesting that I found that we were bringing this in, and we were treated like the new kids on the block. It's like, what do you mean this newfangled kind of approach where you're going to kind of, no, this is how humans learn. We're old school, but somehow we've tricked ourselves into kind of this schedule and bells ringing and whatnot, advancing as kind of being the way it works.
Right.
And I started kind of looking in Gifted Ed, we have all these different models that I didn't know about at first. The school enrichment model and I mean, ideas like that. And I started to wonder, why aren't they taking hold? Like, why?
Yeah.
Why didn't we do this entire Mosaic Collective, which was, it turns out, pretty aligned with the school enrichment model that none of us knew about. But why aren't we all looking at that? And the answer is, it takes investment and time and money to do that. And I started wondering, can we find the natural conversation points and natural training points and passion points that honor teachers' identities in spirit, that they would actually be brought in? And the concept was really around autonomy and agency, if you will. And so I really was curious how we can make secondary gifted education just not matter more, but more joyous, right? And more natural. Because I found a lot of conversations about gifted ed would stop at a certain point. You know, we would talk
Absolutely.
about identification in elementary school, and then it would get a little lower sometimes in middle school, and then high school was like, you know, College Board, right? International Baccalaureate, which that's fine, but that's just acceleration.
Yep.
And that
And
wasn't good enough for me.
yeah, the whole gifted kids will be okay idea is so much worse the older the student gets, right? Is that, oh, there's advanced classes, so just take those, and we don't really care to program outside of that.
No, and then
So,
there's the generational effect, right, as well, because I would always wonder, this wasn't a part of my research directly, but I would wonder as a student who went through that system, if you went through that system and then you had your own kids later on who maybe have that opportunity, are you going to say, okay, cool, I'll support you differently or the same, or are you going to send them to a charter school? Or are you going to homeschool them? Are you, because we started to see those numbers shift a little bit. And I kind of wondered what the new generation of parents were thinking about. And of course, technology is a part of all of this, right? And just connectedness and globalization. Why can't students look at a question like self-healing paint on vehicles? What about it? How does it work? Could a student take that into a history lesson, right? Or could that be, or is that purely science? Well, we learned that I could work with a history teacher on something like that, and very naturally. I gave a TEDx talk 11 years ago that was been seen by like tens and tens of people, but it was all about essentially how can you create a culture of curiosity, and a lot of it was through questions. And then how do you work with those questions? And there's schools for generations that people pay good money to go because that's how they teach there, through questions and in small, you know. And what can we do at scale is what I was really wondering about. And so selecting a research area and doctoral work was really hard for me and my advisor at first, because we had to sift through all this. It took some time. It was real stressful, actually, having to kind of get pinned down on something. I was like, well, how about this?
I totally get it. Yeah, and it feels like truly there's endless routes to take in which way do I want to approach research for gifted education. And so as you went through your research, I understand that you got to visit some other secondary gifted models and really take a look at how other schools are approaching support for our gifted students. And so what were your major takeaways from that, and how has that impacted your work now?
I was fortunate enough to, and this was right before the pandemic, but really look at programs that maybe they weren't explicitly labeled for gifted ed. In fact, two of the three were, but they all were claiming at some level to really maximize students' levels of their agency and their curiosity and their confidence. And one was at the course level, and then one was a program level in a high school, and one was an actual high school itself. And so in doing that, just spending a lot of time in those different kind of participants, if you will. And the participants were teachers themselves and counselors and administrators. I think that the big takeaways, that their techniques and their approaches, whether it was, again, natural or very purposeful. The school developed for gifted ed was very, very purposeful. They had folks come out and train their staff. They're very small, private school, all the way to the class in the program were teachers that had just naturally developed different techniques through their own education. And interestingly enough, the majority of them themselves were identified gifted learners. But all of them, in no particular order, their work, whether it was project-based or discussion, they didn't adhere to one particular approach, but they all were interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary in nature. Whether they were teachers working together or they just had an appreciation and knowledge of what their colleagues were doing. And they had a flexible model enough that they could kind of naturally find those points of harmony for their own. The teachers were highly engaged in this work too, because they were curious, but also for the students. They all had this tremendous appreciation for intensities, which is what I ended up labeling it. I think usually that would be like, you're quirky, you're interesting, let's go, right? And some of the students I work with were traditionally tough, because if you don't know how to roll with that energy, that intensity, it can manifest itself as annoying in some areas, maybe behavior problems. Not all, but a lot of the students that would fall into this, these teachers they could naturally kind of work with and nurture twice exceptionality. And were able to see the strengths and the gifts very clearly. And the students would all say that they really love that about them, because at first some of them would say like they're almost used to using that quirk as kind of a force field. Like, just leave me alone. a little bit.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden the teacher would be like, I'm still here and I actually know the name of that exoplanet around the star. And I mean, like, and they would just kind of vibe off each other like that. And that would actually take the instruction on the conversations naturally to another level. So they all have this appreciation of intensities. They all use technology very, very deeply. And mind you, this was back in 1920. And so, I mean, now we're even more connected, but they didn't adhere to any specific platforms. They didn't say we're a Schoology school or we're a Canvas school. Or, I mean, they would use whatever system that they had, but they didn't overdo it, right? They didn't sponsored by.
Right. Which means they had administrative support to choose what was working for students and them instructionally.
They did. They had that approach, and some of them would articulate this. They had the approach, but they would also sometimes realize that maybe the person they were working with didn't understand the technology, and so they would just like these big words and it would work for them, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
A couple of people said that, but they all had the wherewithal. They themselves saw, whether it's a Google Doc or something different, they just saw the inherent strength is that this is a live document. And so let's use something that's live, because we need to be able to change and add comments. And if that's a Word doc that we can all edit and type into, or we actually need to see the changes live being typed into it, they just understood deeply what the purpose of using it was. And some of that is because they were just so excited about what they were doing. No one stopped to care about, okay, well, what system is that? And a lot of these schools had screens. They had like in the learning environments, they would have like a large TV up on the wall or something like that. They could literally, they couldn't really wirelessly, very convenient, but they could just connect a machine into. And just very naturally, like, hey, check this out. I'm just gonna go right up to that screen. That would happen. BYOD, bring your own device, and all this stuff. All those labels were you just didn't hear them because kids would bring in their devices, but it just became natural. And it wasn't this huge initiative that the school had to provide all these. And it was kind of amazing what students would use. And some kids had access to ridiculous amounts of technology, and other kids didn't have. Right. But I watched some of these kids just going, hey, I've got an extra iPad that we're not using. And so you can use it. Like you can just have it for this. I mean, it was just happening. And so that was connected technology, interdisciplinarity, appreciation of intensities. There was also structured questioning, that every one of these programs in schools valued not just curiosity, but the actual practice of how to ask a question, how to ask for help, how to ask for questions one-on-one, how to ask a question in small groups. There was just so much kind of natural, like, okay, we're grouped up over here, but hey, we're going to present tomorrow. But presentations looked very different. They weren't like these kind of like, let's just put the slides up and kind of pray to the slide, right? I'm going to read every point to you. They were very much like, hey, I got this image here. There aren't any words on the slide, but that's because I'm going to tell you this, and quick, agile, right? Which, I mean, I would argue is kind of how we think and process quite often. And so the presentation itself didn't become the task. It just became kind of the medium to kind of get some information across. But all of them could speak to some type of technique that they use to remind students how to ask questions in schools, how to become vulnerable. There'd be some that would put up images. They would put up images on a screen and do any question sessions where the only rule is you can only ask questions. And these would be images that you look at and you just go, what is going on, right?
Yeah.
And they would do that, and the students, they could free flow questions, for instance, or they could write down questions and then they can share with someone. I mean, all the activities and all the different ways to do it are there, right? It's highly malleable. But they would do all this, and they might look at one image and generate, as a class, no joke, over 100 questions. They would ask questions and then it would kind of level off. But the instructors were skilled enough to not stop. They would wait, because we know wait time, right? Wait time. We give 10 seconds of wait time and it feels like an hour.
Yeah.
But like it's 10 seconds, right? And so they would wait 30 seconds to a minute, and all of a sudden the questions would take off. And so as an aside, I would always joke that like we want to ask why, but we want to ask why twice, right? So we want to go why? Why? It's that second why that resonates, and then how, and then what's next, like a simple protocol. But they would all do this in one place where I would just do these any question sessions, and at the end, that was it. Like that would be like an activity in and of itself. Like it's like going to the gym and working legs or something, right? And coming back. And maybe the teacher would say, okay, that image is actually a great white shark that jumped in the back of the boat. And they would actually give the story of the image to And then they would say, oh, and while they're doing it, a student would ask closed questions at first, yes or no. And then oftentimes the instructors eventually get to a point where it's just hand gestures. They would like point back and they knew that was, can you open the question up? How can you rephrase that and open it up? And sometimes they wouldn't give the answer, but they would give them time to say, well, here, why don't you go look for it? Why don't you go just look for the image? And then, hey, I'm going to give you 2.5 minutes. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, right? And then 5 minutes will come back around and just tell us something interesting you learned about trying to find that image. Or they might say, because everything was scaffolded, they might say, okay, something interesting that you learned about that image, but here's the thing, one slide. You need to show us one slide, no words on the slide. Right. And so then they share the slide with the instructor using some connected technology. And then when it went to your group, the instructor would put the slide up they had, and they would just and everything was kind of quick. Right. And so there's a lot of psychology going there. And so it was structured questioning. And one of the programs was actually taking them through, this will sound familiar, right? Like basically a 5-chapter research project. And they were led by a teacher who himself had worked on dissertations and done some research and stuff. And so theirs was kind of drawn out a little bit longer. And then the last big theme was what I think I called gradual release. And that is whether it was like this one course, which was called Futurology, which was taught by a history teacher and a science teacher together. And so the kids got credit in both subjects. So it was really not launched as a new course. It didn't need to get course approval. But they took 2 courses that already were approved and brought them together. But that class was a semester long. And so they had a semester timetable versus the program was one that was over 2 years. And it was taught as a capstone program that they would scale up versus a school that was entirely built on this. And they had essentially 4 years or a little less if the kids were accelerated. But they had multiple opportunities to lean into these big questions and celebrate the progress. Not so much the answer, but like, here's what we've done and here's what we've learned along the way. That was the shift. But for all these, the teachers and the administrators, they had an approach that was like this. So it was just okay. And if you've ever, taught someone how to ride a bike, right? Or just watched it, it's what you're seeing right there. Very natural. Like, you're going to let go at a certain point. And some of that was natural and some of that was learned, depending on how much formal gifted education was brought in to the staff development.
Yeah.
Gradual release, connected technology, appreciation of intensities, interdisciplinarity, and there's one other one there.
Well, it's hard to believe that it's been 5 years since we defended our dissertations and finished as the world was shutting down. It's an interesting time, I know, for everyone, but especially for us to go from such a intense, engaging research project to all of a sudden that dropping off and we're all staying at home kind of in an instant. So that was interesting, I think, for all of us. But thinking about your 5 years since finishing, what have you been doing? What have your roles been looking like and what's it like today?
So I think what I've been doing is really looking for the best opportunities to continue to push this way for secondary education. But in doing so, I'm still having to feel out the field a little bit and what's going on out there. If it's one thing I learned about in Mosaic is that we have to work within the constraints of the system if it's going to be kind of within the system. But you can push the system, but it takes tremendous time. Education is like infrastructure. It's not, an agile startup business or something like that. And so to do that, I was really looking into what do we already have in play. And so at the time that we finished up, which was during the pandemic. In fact, there's a student that was taking a class at DU that I was teaching on giftedness. He was a student at the time, then he went into teaching. And just this last week, he actually defended his own dissertation at Denver in gifted education. And so that makes you go, okay, it's been a little time. But I shifted out of administration mainly because there was some staffing differences in our district that finally put some FTE behind gifted education in high schools.
Yes, which is not to be understated. That's huge, huge. Our district did it a couple years ago, but it's a huge, huge forward move. So,
and to think that, we're talking 2020, 2021. One of the stipulations was that these gifted and talented facilitators can't be administrators at the same time.
Okay.
Because each school, each high school was started at a 0.5. So a half position. So you would split it with something. And yes, that 0.5 might be working with 2, 3, 4, up to 600 students. But that again, as you said, like we have to celebrate that. It's huge. And so I had to make a decision at that point, gifted education or administration, which I could still influence gifted education because I could work with who the facilitator is. But I made the decision to focus on the GT facilitation. And because we were literally in the middle of the pandemic, my staff also needed someone who had a little bit of background and the ability to kind of help them through that. And so I shared that role with another instructional coach role with another colleague of mine and did the GT facilitation. And then right after that, we were still in the pandemic and they needed someone district wide oversee the district response. So students who still couldn't go into schools, and this had been like 2021, and staff who could not go into schools for whatever reason. And so to bring that under one umbrella, which they had done the year before, but to continue doing that, and they wanted the online school that our district had to run this. And so the administrator at the online school reached out and asked if I would be interested in working on that. And that was K-12. And so I desperately wanted that for K-12. And I knew that experience was also going to have to staff for gifted ed. And it was going to have to staff for special ed and significant needs as well. And multilingual. I mean, everything was going to be involved in that. And in addition from K through 12, which was going to be a wonderful challenge. But I also, in the back of my mind, was really kind of working on seeing this as an opportunity to say, well, as we get more comfortable with online blended, that's out there. And there's private schools and academies that have been using this method forever, right? And homeschool families that would pay to take a course online to kind of enrich or supplement kind of their gifted students or gifted children. I was like, how could we, while we're doing this, still build some structure to leverage that at the district so that maybe one of the positive outcomes from the pandemic would be some online teachers who, had already chosen to teach online. So they already kind of had that motivation and maybe expertise, but then could then open themselves up to working with accelerated students. So an elementary student who might want to take algebra, well, their options for face-to-face are very limited. They might be able to get to a middle school to do that, or maybe even a high school, but it's transportation. And so can there be quality online instruction? And so that was the current, that was working underneath that. And also the advanced learning plan. How could we use some of this technology that we're getting better at through this to perhaps help scale? We still want to make it highly meaningful and relevant to the high school students, but a 0.5 educator can't get around to 500 students. So that kind of drove my push into that. And so I did that. And then right after the pandemic, I was in that role. I was also introduced to alternative schools. And so I was really then wondering, okay, I'm still figuring, look at all these things that are out here that, I wasn't quite sure about, because alternative schools in California, where I grew up, were, at least in my district, were like continuation schools. Oftentimes, so like maybe a fifth if you're a senior type thing. But in my district, these are schools that students could opt into that were going to be smaller learning environments, certainly continuation type schools. They could be afternoon and evening type classes. And they're also overlapping a little bit with like career and technical education. Students could get credit for jobs. And I was like, where are the gifted students here? Like would they just be labeled as underachievers, or are they just so good at seeing through things that they're like, you know what, I'm going here because I can go here and I can have this class of 8 and get to know these teachers and be with really interesting kids who are here for all kinds of reasons, from attendance, I mean, everything. I would rather go there. And I was kind of curious about that. And so then I was still working I left the administration of the online school and said, I want to go back into facilitation for gifted and talented. And I supported 2 buildings. One was alternative kind of afternoon night school. And the other one was a new building that we had just opened up that was all about career and technical education, but also we're bringing in concurrent enrollment and dual enrollment partnerships with universities.
Great. Yeah.
And so now at this point, I'm thinking, okay, where are the gifted students and the alternative programs, but how are our gifted students really kind of working with and leveraging these career and technical classes, which growing up, we called them vocational education, but certainly auto shop and carpentry are part of it, but welding, aviation, architecture, culinary, robotics, educators, there are all these other programs. And so some districts have moved to create these central hubs that can support students from all different campuses. Now, it's not new, and you know this, right? Like from your district and other districts, that we've had specialized schools for these over the years. But then now there's like this new movement to how can we build this building, if you will, that not only are students going to go take those classes, but they're going to get either community college or university credit for doing that, and then maybe go back to their building. So they might like start their building for a couple classes and then go to this campus to take architecture classes and earn certificates in the industry, meet experts in the field, righteously go on field trips. And so I was working at both of those. And then this last year, I was asked to teach at the CTE concurrent enrollment and part of the Future Educator program. So the teacher education program. So the students, the juniors and seniors that actually want to be educators.
Yeah.
And that was affiliated with a local university. And so teach there, but also support the gifted students. And then I've also been working with a colleague to kind of really research and address the question, how are gifted kids in our district accessing this program? Why? How can we identify from this work and support? And then how can we support these teachers, these experts? Because some of these experts are coming into teaching like a career in architecture, but never teaching high school students. And that dynamic, but they find the talent. How do they find the talent? How do we support them? And how do we support them? What does a math identification look like in aviation, for instance? What does it look like in culinary? And where our students, for instance, in culinary are going to, talk about events and planning. They say culinary, events, and hospitality. But then the gifted, working with the gifted student in the culinary program who is interested in molecular gastronomy and entrepreneurship and how to make healthy and affordable delivery for food. So how in the world do I support this chef working with a student who, in addition to this, wants to do this? And so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm working in the career and technical area in concurrent enrollment and dual enrollment, but also supporting gifted students that come to this building. But I also have to liaise with all of our high schools who have support in the high schools too. And so they're supporting the student in their classes in the high school, but what do they look like when they come to this building? And that's what I'm keeping busy right now with that.
There's something interesting that keeps getting brought up in the work that I'm doing is around honors courses and gifted or advanced students, choosing honors courses instead of CTE because of our transcript GPA game. Is that something that you are thinking through? And what new thoughts do you have around that to offer? I've just done a ton of research about Douglas County's new honors initiative to really, really align what honors courses mean, what the actual course descriptions are, so that that's indicative and reflective of the weighted grade that students get. But I think still the broader question is that taking away from students' choice to want to go to CTE? Is there a place for honors CTE courses? I mean, what does this look like, really?
This is where it needs to go because, the menu of options that the choices that our students have in terms of which courses, because the number one level of differentiation that happens for students at high school is course selection. It can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
It can actually be done sometimes out of places of fear or pressure. Again, I joke about the AP calculus problem. Well, if I do this, I can't take calculus and then I'm not going to get it on my transcript.
And that what you choose as a ninth grader, you're set and you can't change your mind in 2 years.
Yeah.
And
the advanced learning plan and expert facilitation and support with someone in the building or working with the building is meant to push on that, right? Righteously push on that, not willy-nilly, but to actually bring in data and support. And say, well, actually, I think we can do this. We can maybe skip this or do this differently or whatever, and without kind of introducing a slippery slope. But having said that, when we have a numeric scale, that when our students leave school at a certain point, they are essentially defined by, right? Those that are definitely going, I'm going to this next level, and they need to see your GPA, your class ranking, and maybe some test scores along the way. That's a lot for 12, 13 years to distill down to. And so obviously, our students are going to play the numbers literally. And so when you've got an option for one class to count as a 5, right, or a 4.5 or something like that, the other thing that comes with looking at courses that are called honors or something like that is an opportunity to say, like you mentioned, what is this course, right? Is it accelerated? Or is it going to look a little bit different? Is it going to have a little bit more depth to it, right? Will it be a little bit more kind of nuanced or complex? And that goes back to my first years of teaching, working with my mentor when we were developing a class for gifted and talented students in chemistry. It looked different. We needed fewer repetitions here, and that afforded us to do this here. And so it was very much like conducting kind of an orchestra in that case. So we had two things going here. We have the AP and the IB courses, which are already 5-point weighted, and then in Douglas County there was policy for honors to be weighted, but wasn't in practice at this time, and so they weren't weighted, and kids were starting to kind of go, okay, well then can I just skip right to these year 2 kind of AP courses? In some cases, like chemistry would be seen as like a year 2 chemistry course and stuff. And so the conversation circulated again about, okay, honors, and then how can instructors actually design for these learners? But CTE and concurrent enrollment, for instance, was kind of left off too. So we had this one problem where, again, at the school I was at was accelerated. So kids would sometimes double up in math. And the math courses we had were kind of numbered. So they go say math 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whether they started, they could double up. Then they might go calc 1, AB, calc 2, BC. And then these kids were taking some of these kids were taking 3 years of calculus. And then they might even go take differential equations, which would be done at a community college. Well, we found out that, okay, the AP courses, the calc 1 and calc 2 were weighted, but technically the calc 3, which was a community college and Arapahoe Community College course, was not weighted. And I'm like, how do you justify that? How do you justify going through 2 weighted courses and then not? And then the same thing. And so we actually had a practice of, we would just weight it in the transcript. That part you might have to edit out. I don't know. But we would go in as administrators in the building and just go, tink, right?
Right.
And then eventually that came up centrally, and we had to justify that. And I think that maybe some other practices that were happening, probably yada, yada, kind of got this conversation going to say, why aren't we weighting those? And so our district just finally, after I think about a year and a half, with the community and teachers and whatnot, are now also weighting CTE and concurrent enrollment courses starting next year.
Okay.
So the students that are going to go take those architecture classes know that they're going to be on that 5-point scale, just like the AP course. And so we're able to bring up some research to say, well, other places have done this before. What will happen if we do that? And of course, you're going to get a bump in numbers. You're going to get a bump in enrollment because people suddenly go, you're big leagues too. I can take that class as well. But then it also introduces what you're talking about is then, okay, is there equity involved in these courses across the board, or is it so different from one school to another and one teacher to another? And that's an opportunity, depending on how site-based or kind of centrally managed your district might be. And in Douglas County, we tend to be a little bit more site-based, and so there's a lot of pride in each school, and that's wonderful. But then sometimes bringing that together can be a little bit challenging. So yeah, starting next year, and then I believe retroactive 1 or 2 years, CTE and concurrent enrollment courses that are part of a pathway are weighted. And so I mentioned the campus I work at Douglas County, which is called Legacy Campus. Our numbers of students that are identified as gifted and talented are relatively high compared to the buildings, and that number has increased next year. And I think a large part of it, haven't asked the students yet, but I think a large part of that has to do with that weighting. It also has to do with the fact that we have our facilitators in those buildings, and we meet together and we are able to discuss, and my colleagues can say, what is that class over there at Legacy? What's going on in EMT services, right? And then we actually can spend some time saying, okay, well, this is what they learned to be an EMT, but our students that we work with in buildings might also know that a lot of students who are pre-med, who want to become physicians or nurses or physician's assistant, a lot of times they become EMTs in undergrad to help get into medical school. So then we see a bump in that program so we expand the conversation, to kind of catch the students that we know want to engage in the conversation at that point. Oh, okay, well, I didn't think about, learning to be a chef, but I really want to know how to actually get rid of these food deserts and work this way. And it's more of a societal problem, but I want to start there. Oh, it's weighted? Well, then I think I can take AP Calculus off my schedule, and nothing against AP Calculus, wonderful course, but
well, I think it all goes back to what you were mentioning earlier, which is around relevance, right? Is that students and families are struggling to pick like what's relevant and interesting to students versus how the game is laid out to play. And so if we can affect the way that the rules of the game are played, then the result can be increased relevance in courses and students who are in them in secondary.
It has to be, and it also has to be the advanced learning plan. Because sometimes I talk to colleagues or even presenting, and I might be provocative and say the advanced learning plan in high schools is broken. But we can unpack that a little bit and say, well, how can we? Because those goals, if not broken, and if they work, having a meaningful goal that can be worked towards is just opens so many thought doors for students and for families and for educators. But when you're working with 200, 300, 400, 500 students, and you're just hoping to get compliance by September 30th to get those goals checked off, that's a huge task in and of itself. And so how can we, this goes back to when I was talking about the online school, how can we leverage naturally and appropriately like technology to amplify it, but not game it, right? But amplify it in a way that might make one person or the GT facilitator seem like 5 or 6 or 7. And I think, what we were leveraging at first was just the speed of light, right? And online, and just the ability to kind of organize things kind of in shells that we got used to in the pandemic. But now I think leveraging maybe some abilities to kind of script and prompt AI can be very helpful too. Because
absolutely, that's something we're taking a huge leap forward. But if we can affect the time it takes to get the plan written, we can increase the meaningfulness of the plan is truly what I believe the goal. And I think that's what you're saying as well.
Yep. The meaningfulness. And then of course, all the while working with our teachers to increase their awareness, and then which leads to be able to address their competency. So that's a learning curve, awareness to competency to advocacy. Sometimes we confuse awareness and advocacy, but awareness leads to competency, which is that training through staff development, to advocacy, which leads to system action. Then they know where to find the advanced learning plans. They know what they mean and contribute to them. And this isn't about this, but the idea of being able to prompt with AI is that you can use a tutoring model to at least have a dialogue. And students will appreciate that, because that's better than just saying, here's a STEM, fill it out, or here, just write an effective goal. And they're like, what, and you might get some goals that say, I just want to get A's. Oh, that's cool. But like, if I was talking to you in person, we would probably unpack that a little bit more. And,
yeah.
But the realities are. So yeah, I think that would be kind of a righteous use of, I think, generative AI. And yeah, so glad to hear that you guys are working on that too. No surprises, but we should be able to, we should all develop those and even share prompts. Like,
yes.
Here's the prompt we used in chat versus Magic,
Yes.
Because it's all about getting those prompts dialed in. It should almost be maybe a statewide initiative, something like that.
We can lead that, right?
Something
we're working on too, because Magic School has the ALP chatbot in there, which is amazing, and we just have a whole spectrum of willingness spectrum, early adopter to people who are never wanting to do it. And so it's like, how do we approach this really valuable tool in a way that honors educators are, and gets it useful faster. So I think we're at a really exciting time in education as it relates to AI and how we can really move forward. And like you're saying, the larger, bureaucratic systems that we're within are harder to move forward as fast as we'd like to. However, there are all of these opportunities for us to show different ways to approach the work that we are doing right now. One of the things we're working on is a custom chatbot within Magic School, differentiating up for our advanced learners, because in our district too, we have just a wide array of curricula that's being taught. We have gifted teachers who are supporting so many different grade levels, so many different contents, right? And people now are coming and asking, truly, how do I differentiate this? But we don't expect all those people to be experts in every grade level and every content and every curricula. So how can we use AI to at least get us 60% of the way there? Like, let's get a bump forward on what can we do to help support these teachers, and let's start creating a tool, because over the next few years, we can make it so much better as more users really start using it,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that getting that foundational work in play is what's going to, again, like, open the minds and open the thinking, so that, yes, in a geometry class, you've got standards to learn in geometry, but you can also expand the conversation for motivated and capable learners who want to do that. And that is transformational. Absolutely. I kind of prefer that to a conversation I had recently with just a wonderful colleague who basically was saying, do you think that we're just doing too much in schools? That essentially, as we continue to kind of apply more labels, which come with plans, which he understands why we do that, right? But that this is like a tree that's just getting so heavy and so full that the tree will eventually collapse, right? And then if the system does collapse, what kind of comes up in its place? Which part of me likes to engage in that conversation. Part of me also thinks that is like apocalyptic a little bit to some extent.
Sure.
But, he would root in a conversation about the meta crisis and everything going on and just results of globalization. But for me, our kids want to kind of look into that kind of work. Like, I think that the tree can prune itself to some extent by doing some of this work and giving some of these opportunities for, again, our most motivated and capable students to kind of lean in to some of these bigger problems and seeing them as opportunities to help education essentially mend itself a little bit. And that's the potential that I feel like is what's driving me and you, I think, but me especially in secondary, to make sure that students aren't waiting to go home to do all the kind of stuff that really, really motivates them, that they don't have to give up those other hours of their life to do that. And that's where I really find a lot of hope and kind of in that, essentially. it's not just saying I find hope in our students, but I'm never surprised. I'm never surprised when I work with students and when they realize that they can untether, so to speak, their thinking. And then when they're also working with other students who can untether their thinking a little bit too, and that virtuosity that kind of comes forward. It's not about just identifying all the problems, but it's also looking for the opportunities and the synthesized thinking that's coming out, the new thinking, and that's the true innovation. And I mean deep. I don't just mean, hey, these kids did these wonderful projects, and so let's bring them out to the school board and let's celebrate them. Yeah, let's do that. But to me, that seems very shallow. That a lot of times kids do real things, and we politely clap and go, "Yay, good job!" Hercules, and then we're just gonna take you to the school board and celebrate you. But what if we had so many kids doing things like that we couldn't bring them to the school board because the school board would never have time to meet? Because we would be celebrating all these potential ideas that these students would have. Gifted students, certainly, but all of our students, and then our teachers as well. Because I really think that our teachers are tremendously capable once they understand their identity of teachers and they're allowed to grow within that identity, and we support them and we bring in, this is what gifted education best practices are, and here's why. And it doesn't have to be a 2-week training condensed down to 1 hour. That's ridiculous. But it's a good example, I guess, of a compaction, right? And we actually sink our teeth into something that's based in their identity. We all got into this profession. You heard my convoluted student story, essentially, but we all got into this for reasons. I felt somewhat called into the profession, and I think we should embrace that and stop treating ourselves as educators like we're all the same, because we're not.
Yeah.
And so I think that another hope I have is just that we talked about ALPs, but as gifted education, I think that are we able to create like some type of development packages, if you will, like micro learning examples that could go to buildings, and then facilitators or whoever's there can use those? Maybe we say, hey, these couple are non-negotiable, right? But you can add to these rather than expecting those people to go into their buildings and create everything on their own from scratch.
Right.
We have to do better with that.
I agree. And I thank you for sharing where you're hopeful as we move forward. It's such a wonderful thing that I get to hear from all of my guests. And I'm hopeful as I listen to you and listen to the work that you and your team are really pushing forward, that we can make progress, even amidst, all the struggles that we're going through in education and things that we can't control, that there is still enough that we can press on and can control. And the things that we're seeing students come back with who are really engaged and the programs that are working for them can really influence us as adults and educators to keep going. So I just want to open it up for any last words from you on hope for the future as we move ahead.
I've been doing this since 2000, and I feel like I've just got more energy now, and a lot of that just comes from a lot of the opportunities we've talked about, and you just summarized there. But really, it's working with the students and the teachers that are working with the students, and I think that there is just so much kind of untapped potential. And if we can just kind of somewhat learn to get out of our own way a little bit, even though it's all well-intended, and really ask all the time in whatever we do, whether it's designing a lesson or whether it's evaluating a teacher, why, how, and then what's next. And if you could stick to those questions, I really think that it can just identify all kinds of opportunities that are out there. Let's not overcomplicate things.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'd love to have you back, and we can geek out more on the AI end and what we're doing and how we can help impact educators as they support our students. So thanks so much. I appreciate you, Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks, Meryl.
This episode of Exceptionally Speaking is brought to you by Hex 24 Press, where education meets imagination. I founded Hex 24 Press in 2024 to uplift educator voices and provide a publishing home for myself and other educators to bring our work into the world. You can find more information about today's guests, including links to their resources and services, at hex24press.com. Thank you for supporting educators, independent creators, and small business. We're so glad you're here.